Bardzo się cieszę, że jesteście Państwo z nami. Dzisiejszy dzień to 4 sesje naukowe na bardzo ważne i aktualne tematy. I myślę, że możemy już rozpocząć pierwszą z sesji. Zatem sesja dotyczyć będzie konsekwencji gospodarczych wojny na Ukrainie. Prowadzić sesję będzie profesor, doktor habilitowany inżynier Witold Kwaśnicki z Uniwersytetu Wrocławskiego, a także przedstawiciel Towarzystwa Ekonomistów Polskich. Pan profesor będzie z nami w trybie online, także serdecznie pana profesora zapraszam do prowadzenia sesji. Pragnę również zaprosić uczestników dzisiejszej pierwszej sesji, przedstawicieli Wyższej Szkoły Informatyki i Zarządzania w Rzeszowie, panią dr Mariannę Bidę i panią dr Irynę Rudą. Zapraszam na scenę. Zapraszam również doktora Krzysztofa Błędowskiego z Towarzystwa Ekonomistów Polskich, pana Jacka Wojciechowicza z Towarzystwa Ekonomistów Polskich również. Będzie z nami w trybie online również pan Dmytro Bojarczuk, dyrektor wykonawczy Centrum Analiz Społeczno-Ekonomicznych. I przekazuję głos do pana profesora. Myślę, że możemy zacząć.
Dzień dobry Państwu, witam serdecznie. I will switch into English because due to the participation of our friends from Ukraine, we ought to communicate in English, so please forgive me. It's my great pleasure to moderate that panel discussion. We have roughly saying 70 minutes for discussion and great number of questions and problems to cover. So I will only say a few words about the participants. I will ask specific questions to each of the participants, and after that there will be a general discussion between those participants, and in the end the discussion and the questions from the audience. First I would like to ask two women from our friends from Ukraine. Marianna Bida is assistant professor at the University of Information Technology and Management in Rzeszów, but also she is associate professor of international economics at Lviv, Ivan Franko National University, and financial director of a subsidiary reliability company Holland on Ukraine. And Irina Ruda is assistant professor at the university, the same university in Rzeszów, and also the associate professor of the Department of Digital Economy and Business Analytics at Lviv, Ivan Franko National University. And to the first speakers, Marianna and Irina, I would like to send the questions. We'll start from some specific problems on Ukraine. Next, we'll go to the regional problems, and next, in the end, we'll talk about the general global economy. So, Marianna and Irina, can you comment on the current state of Ukraine economy during the war and the prospect for reconstruction of the Ukrainian economy after the war? It will end in hopefully as soon as possible. So I will keep a strict time. I have some device, my so I'm giving you 9 minutes to answer. 2 minutes before the end of your speech, I will give a sign that you will go to the end of the presentation. So the floor is yours, Marianna and Irina.
Morning, everyone. So today is actually 100 days since the war has started, and we have some small conclusions to make. So the war in Ukraine is really devastating, not just for the country as a country, but also for its economy. Before the war, Ukraine was an open economy and it was developing quite fast, even after the period of contraction after the pandemic. And the GDP was rising every single year except for this period of pandemic. The GDP per capita was also improving every year. Even though Ukraine comprises just and represents just 0.13% of the world economy, It was the main supplier of crude oil, of seeds, of steel and iron. And right now, most of those possibilities are blocked for Ukraine. And the current state of things in Ukraine is really very pessimistic. So according to the latest analysis, the Ukrainian economy will probably shrink by 45% till the end of the year. The debt to GDP ratio will reach 86%. But the biggest problem for the Ukrainian economy right now is the income expenditure budget gap. So before the war, the budget deficit was just 3.4% of GDP, in 2021. And right now, the actual need to compensate for this budgetary gap is estimated at $5 billion US. So each month, Ukraine needs $5 billion of additional money to compensate for this gap. So there are some ways how we are managed to deal with this problem. First of all, the government has introduced military bonds. This is one way of financing this budget gap. And the terms for these bonds are very precise. So it is 1 year of circulation and 11% per annum. But it is already lower than the official inflation rate. It was like almost 17% at the end of May. But nevertheless, most of those military bonds were bought by the National Bank of Ukraine by actually printing money to buy these bonds. And altogether, since the war has started, the National Bank of Ukraine has printed the equivalent of $4 billion. That is a huge problem for the economy, but since it is using the tool of the last resort, this right to the National Bank was granted by the Ukrainian government to do so in the exceptional cases. And the war, for sure, is an exceptional case. But of course, we all understand that it will trigger inflation to higher levels. On the other hand, there is also some foreign help from international donors, namely from the European Union and from the IMF. Some part of this money is granted on the non-refundable basis, which is very great support for the Ukrainian economy, while some part of this money has to be returned. So even if we take into account all these three ways of financing the budget deficit, it still looks not enough if the war is going to last longer. That is why Ukrainian government is using all its creativity to help the economy. First of all, they are relocating the business to the western borders. The National Bank has introduced some very strict rules for, first of all, it has fixed the exchange rate at the very first day of the war at the level of 29 hryvnias per US dollars, and introduced a very strict control over the capital movement. Right now, it is officially prohibited to invest abroad and to repatriate companies' profit abroad. And the cash can be bought only to finance the critical imports and only in non-cash forms. So that was done to prevent the outflow of international foreign currency from the Ukrainian economy. Besides, most of the citizens who left the country also face some limits. They cannot withdraw they can withdraw money abroad, but there are certain limits. So both the government, represented by the Ministry of Finance, and the National Bank are trying their best somehow to cope with all the challenges. But there is also one positive feature which I would like to mention. For example, no bank has went bankrupt since the war has started, and that is, to my mind, is a very good sign, meaning that even though Ukrainians were very worried about their deposits and started to withdraw them, but they still have some belief in the banking system, and one proof for that is that the deposits of the Ukrainians are increasing. So in comparison with the first day of war, they have increased by 19%, and that is a very good sign. Maybe the reason for that was that the government decided to guarantee all the amount of deposits in the accounts of Ukrainians to the whole period of the martial law. And as a result, people started to somehow support banking system. Moreover, they are also buying those military bonds, even though, as I have already mentioned, their interest rate is lower than the inflation right now. To somehow mitigate this problem, the National Bank of Ukraine has decided just yesterday to increase the discount rate to 25%. This is an unprecedented step by the National Bank, because the discount rate was 10%, so it has increased it by 15%, hoping that this like restrictive monetary policy will somehow strengthen the position of Ukrainian hryvnias, will make banks to increase their deposits rates, and will also somehow stabilize the exchange rate of Ukrainian currency. So I hope these steps will be enough to help us cope with the war.
Dzień dobry Państwu. Hello to everyone. First of all, thank you for this opportunity to be here in this discussion, and thank you for your interest to Ukraine economy. And I will concentrate in small and medium business and all losses that we have in our country right now. All of you see how Russians destroy our country, our life. And I just remember the day, the 24th of February, when my husband called me at 5 o'clock in the morning and tell me that Russians become bombing the capital. And please, my husband is military, and he told me, please don't worry, prepare all documents, money, medicine, and just stay at home. And a lot of people in Ukraine stay at home, and it was a big panic. It was the time when we don't know answer to many questions. And of course, from these hours, from the day, our businesses stop in all over the country, mostly, yes. Of course, people is very adaptable, and from day to day, and now we have not bad recovery of small and medium business, but we have a really gross losses because the situation was and now it's very disbalanced in Ukraine. It's very difficult in all life, and of course of business. And small and medium business is like a heart in a body, I think, for the country, because it's give us 60% of GDP. In Ukraine, it's 7 million of jobs, and it's 40% of tax revenue. For example, we lose like around $85 billion in small and medium business right now. And it's a huge, and we know that the war is going, and is the data is changing from day to day. And at the beginning of the war, like around 50% of small and medium business just stop their work at all. Now we have a little bit better situation, but you know that 20% of our country now is occupied by Russians. And of course, also we have the problems that Mariana told, that we have a lot of relocated business and company, like around 10% of small and medium business relocated abroad. I think that is huge losses, because mostly of them will not come back to Ukraine. They will stay in a European country, in United States or another country at all. And it also, this relocated, it's also few minutes.
No more.
It's okay. It's also loses 10% of our GDP because of relocation. And also big problem with unemployment. It's like around 1,200,000 unemployment. A lot of people lose their jobs or have a vacation without payment. And also I will talk a few words about that our government do what they can just. They decrease taxes, they help to recover business and do everything what they need. For example, in Ukraine now, if you can't pay tax, you will not, and you don't have any problem with that. Just we have decrease VAT from 20% to 2%. We don't need any different documents like license to open business. The climate to provide business in Ukraine, it's not bad right now. The government do everything what they can to do. Thank you for attention.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I'm so taught and I'm strict to keep the time. It's one of the tasks of a moderator. So the next speaker is Dmytro Boyarchuk. He is the executive director of the Kiev-based office of the Center for Social and Economic Research, CASE, Ukraine. But Dmytro has an extensive experience in consulting state bodies on economic reforms in Ukraine and other countries. So I think that he will tell us about the future of the Ukrainian economy and how the perspectives are after the war. So the floor is yours, Dima.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to speak. Actually, the situation is quite difficult, and the damage for Ukrainian economy was really hard. And the bad news that we still don't know how seriously the economy was damaged. In the first months of the war, we knew that near 60% that active military actions were on the territories which produced near 60% of GDP, and now it's near 20% of GDP of those territories which occupied or experience active military actions. But the point is that it's not necessarily only those territories. All areas of Ukraine have been damaged in this or other way. And for instance, even now, already the fourth month of this war, we have no statistics on industrial output. We have no numbers on retail trades. We have very general numbers on budget revenues and on deficit. And we have very general numbers on external accounts. So we still are operating with very rough estimates of potential impact from 30 to 50% of GDP drop. We see that, as previous speaker mentioned, that we experience serious problems with budget. It's not that budget plummeted dramatically, but expenses increased. sharply because we have a lot of displaced people which are claiming for help. We have a huge military spending, and for March, April, and May, deficit was on the level of $2 to $3 billion per month, which is a huge number. And as it was mentioned, Ministry of Finance is claiming that our needs are on the level of $5 to $7 billion per month. And we experience substantial outflow on external accounts due to growing expectation, devaluation sentiments. And yesterday there was a decision to increase prime rate, to hike prime rates up to 25%, which was a kind of shocking news. But it's a signal that developments are not very good for us. What we should expect? I think that situation will be aggravating. We are lucky that near 80% of arable lands remain under our control, and we will have enough of foods for us, and we will have enough of grains for exports. But our seaports are blocked, and actually, it's a big problem in terms of exporting foods to the countries, and in terms of generating export proceeds. And there were different attempts to find a way how to solve this problem and what to do. But the reality is that we are not able to export all available grains through railway channels, and the only way to deblock our seaports is a military way in mid-term. In longer term, possibly there might be some other opportunities. A huge problem of migration. United Nations reports that 6.8 people left Ukraine, mainly women, children, and elderly people, and maybe the number is smaller because many people are returning. But the problem is that Ukrainians are considering seriously a scenario of a kind of frozen conflict. And in this case, most likely many people will not return because it's a big threat of new aggression. It's a big threat of it's a big problem of security. How to build this strategy of reconstruction, how to build this strategy of recovering the country when many people might be planning to migrate to leave the country for long or even forever. It's a big question. And how to build the strategy of reconstruction when we talk a lot about Marshall Plan, but the big difference between Marshall Plan and what we have now and what we will have in several months is that after the World War II, Nazi Germany was totally destroyed. There was no big risk for security. Our reality is that Russia might be not defeated totally, and how to develop under this scenario, it's not clear so far. People are talking. We have a lot of discussion on this topic, but there is no clear picture how this future might develop. Actually, that's all for me. Thank you for attention.
Thank you. So I'm really glad that you keep some constraints. Please, I would like to ask those people who are connected online to the conference, on chat you may write the questions. There will be a time for open discussion and giving the question to the panelists. So our next speaker is Krzysztof Błędowski. Krzysztof Błędowski is a senior economist with over 20 years experience in industrial and financial economics. He is currently the senior country director and economist at Manufacturers Alliance, a policy research forum in Arlington, Virginia, US. He also was working at the International Monetary Funds and also Commerzbank in Central Europe and Pioneer Polish Trust Funds. He is native of Poland, holds degrees from the University of Poland, US and UK. So to Krzysztof, I would like to ask to send the questions related to the problems of economies of the United States and the European Union, and to the extent the war on Ukraine and all things around that were influence the economies of United States and European Union. So the floor is yours, Krzysztof. You have 9 minutes, let's say.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. First of all, I'd like to bring the difference between the current administration in Washington and the previous administration between 2016 and 2020. If we go back to the Trump era, one of Trump's secretaries of state, Mark Pompeo, is supposed to have said, and this is an informal quotation, I'm not even sure that it has been documented, and he said somewhere, "Do you think that the Americans give a damn about Ukraine?" And then fast forward to today, and there's absolutely no doubt about it that the Biden administration and the American people are definitely thinking that it's worth supporting Ukraine, worth paying the price to maintain the freedom and to spend the money necessary to keep the war going in Ukraine's favor. So that's one opening statement. The second is that I will say much less about the impact on the United States. It's also because the impact is smaller and concentrated on Europe, but I may not go over everything given the constraints of time. So in terms of the United States, the first thing is that just as the European Union, the United States revoked the most favored nation clause. So that really affected trade to a big degree. Now, the impact through trade is very little. So it went through higher import prices, the more difficulty in exporting, but that's a fractional impact, not even worth indicating in terms of percentage points or dollars. Now, in terms of the ban on oil and gas, that's more substantial. But again, America is not dependent on that gas and oil, but the impact is indirect through higher oil prices. And not just higher oil prices, but also higher prices of the intermediate inputs that come from those that feed into, let's say, chemical industry and some of the other ones. Neon gas, of which Russia and Ukraine account for about 50%, is huge, a huge feedstock into the chemical industry, and that has been hugely impacted. A much more substantial channel is disrupted supply chains, and I'll just mention a few. Imports of wheat, natural gas I mentioned, and some of the others. It's more expensive to produce food, and so regardless whether the war touches the United States, and it directly does not, through higher food prices and the inputs that go into food price production, that translate into higher inflation. And we know that food is an important portion of the consumer basket. And then finally, something that I think escapes a lay audience that does not follow the business side, like my colleague here indicated, and that is the logistics of shipping goods across oceans. And the biggest impact has been on lanes, ocean lanes from Europe to the United States. It's much more difficult to get containers move cargo space. It's also more difficult to source. Of course, prices have gone up. So that, to the extent that the European and American supply chains are integrated, that has affected negatively obviously the production across the Atlantic. And then finally, there is the slowing economic growth. The impact here is difficult to measure because it's commingled with the slowing economic cycle overall. So let's just say that GDP by the end of 2022 may be just growing at about 2% versus without the war in Ukraine maybe marginally higher. I will skip monetary policy for a second, but come back to it at the end. So let's quickly go to Europe. And whereas in the United States, supply chain and slower economic growth may be the biggest salient channels, in Europe, it's much more energy mix, and inflation. And so let's start with energy. And we should distinguish between coal and oil on one hand and gas on the other. On coal and oil, these are fungible commodities, and Russia is a worldwide price taker for those. The demand curve is elastic. There's some substitution possible, although not across the board. Gas is much more difficult to ship technically, and Russia is also a quasi-monopolist in some markets in Europe. So that's a big factor in a complete divestiture of the European Union, or let's just say Europe, from Russian gas. So there are technical constraints, and then there are political constraints, of which I will say nothing. So in the meantime, short of cutting Russia from supplying Europe with these carbohydrates, there are tariffs, and tariffs are a good intermediate medium because it could shift somewhat the demand curve. It could lead to substitution, could lead also to choked consumption, which is a good thing, and could shift potentially the demand, although again constrained towards renewables. So in the intermediate term, I think tariffs might be the way to go. Also, we might see something that had been happening in the United States, but also in Europe, namely reassuring and re-examining the just-in-time supply chain scenarios, and that may be just bolstered or fortified by the war. Precautionary savings, and again, this would differ by country. In times of war, that doesn't touch you directly. People are more cautious about spending, and so there could be some effect there, but it's difficult to quantify it at this stage, given the huge uncertainty how the war develops going from here. Let's move to trade and finance very briefly. So, on the trade side, here are the calculations. And I will just use the shortcut of EU rather than Europe, but if the EU were to cut trade completely with Russia, I think the estimate of damage to the European economies on the order of 0.5 to 0.6 of GDP, first order of magnitude the first year, and maybe then distributed lags throughout the subsequent year. So it's not a dramatic impact, but not insignificant. 0.5% are still billions of euros. In terms of the FDI, not current actually because of the divestiture, but the pre-war stock, that's not the flow, but stock of FDI of Europe, just Europe, into Ukraine was about 300 billion euros. And if all of that stock is either divested, which is difficult, or written off, basically lost, that would hit the GDP to some extent, and it would also not affect that much the overall stock of FDI that the European firms and individuals have invested, because that stock represents only about 2% of overall outbound FDI of Europe to the rest of the world, of which Russia is these 2%. Now, what about a little bit further to finance? What if Russia were to sequentially default on its obligations, public and private? I think it's fair to say that the impact on those creditors, those lenders who lend in a concentrated way, and there are just a few banks, would be somewhat substantial but not existential, not in the sense that they would be running into insolvency problems. They may need some rounds of recapitalization. I think the more important point here is that unlike the crisis, the Great Recession following the financial crisis of 08, 09, 10, 11, I think the type of systemic spillover effects to the rest of the banking system and the financial system writ large, I think are much smaller. So that's worth emphasizing. What about fiscal policy? How much more time do I have? Do I have 2-3 minutes? Witold? You're muted. Okay.
No. So 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay. Fiscal policy. Higher defense spending. I won't go into details. Everybody's spending more or will spend more for obvious reasons. Manage refugee flow. Some numbers are interesting. Let's say if we, in the first year of taking a refugee, if we count about 10,000 euros per refugee to resettle, initially feed, reassign to jobs, train, and so on, and we count 5 million, I think we heard figures of already about 7 million who have left, although that's a distributed flow. That comes to about 50 billion euros, which is totally almost a rounding change in terms of what Europe can contribute and do, and that may be enlarged through the rest of the world, although most of the refugees are going to Europe. So that's about 3 to 0.4% of GDP. That's an entirely manageable fiscal cost. Now, I will not go into details in terms of energy and the fiscal side of energy, but Europe clearly will have to make structural change in terms of how energy is sourced, consumed, and that may need some fiscal support, so that fiscal cost should be counted in there. And again, I will not go into details. What about the cushioning of impact on food prices and overall inflation? And there are several channels, including taxation, lump sum transfers, or maybe even price regulation. I'm, of course, very cautious about tinkering with price regulation. It's inefficient, distortionary. Lump sum looks to me means tested, meaning that the poorer households would receive it. It's a much better idea. Temporarily lowering energy taxes, I think that's much more of a political solution. It's not really a viable economic solution. Okay, on the financing side, there are basically two ways to pay for it. And we heard already one channel that Ukraine is doing, war bonds. That's a possibility. I don't think this will fly politically. Europe is not a belligerent in the sense that it's not directly attacked. This would be also politically somewhat difficult, so that leaves the deficit spending channel. And frankly speaking, I think in these uncertain times, I think this may be a preferable route, and I think this is what will end up happening. 2 words about monetary policy, and I'll close. And that's, I defer talking about the Fed to this moment. And now the monetary policy is everybody. When you're hit by a shock like we have been all hit, not just Ukraine, but the rest of Europe, the rest of the world to some extent, the standard monetary policy, and we have a former central banker here in the room, is to accommodate initially to cushion the shock and then tighten to make sure the impact doesn't get out of hand. Now, I think that this would be somewhat problematic, particularly that both the European Central Bank and the Fed are engendering or are carrying out monetary policy that is kind of on a new cycle independent of the war. So I think that given all that, the impact of that war may be insignificant in how both the Fed and the European Central Bank will continue with their tightening cycle. I think from what I have learned from talking with the Fed is that they are so much fixated on how to manage inflation expectation, how to make sure they are anchored. And the war in Ukraine is almost a marginal impact in their overall scheme of things. So open questions, how to use sanctions in the future to deter Russia from making trouble elsewhere, or maybe even de-escalating the war, and how to keep the balance between the political and the economic side in decision-making. And that's it. Let me close with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Krzysztof. And our next speaker is Jacek Wojciechowicz. He is an expert in business ethics, UN Global Compact Poland, and also the lecturer at the Collegium Civitas at the Warsaw University. He was graduated from the Warsaw School of Economics, but also studied at the La Trobe University in Australia. Between 1999 and up to 2007, was a senior communication specialist at the World Bank. I would like to address to Jacek the questions related to the global economy, and especially also the role of China, and how the global economy will look after the ending of the war. The floor is yours, Jacek. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this kind introduction. I think that we had a great assessment of what is happening or what can happen in the global economy made by Krzysztof Błędowski. But nevertheless, I would like to make one point, which is a common sense. Everything would depend on how long this conflict is to last. We basically don't know, but the prolongated conflict makes the losses much harder, much deeper, and the impact on the global economy will be also much deeper. According to the OECD research conducted a long time ago, the possible impact on the global economy of the war, based on what we know now, in 2022 would be probably about 1%. So it means that actually the global GDP would contract by 1%. This would, of course, differ because according to the recent report by the World Bank, the GDP in the Europe and Central Europe and Central Asia countries will contract by approximately 4%. So in terms of actually the economic slowdown, it will be visible, but it will be not equally distributed all over the world. Before I get to China, I would like also to point out at certain dangers which are happening right now. The dangers, of course, are that the conflict actually, and I'm more like a political analyst than a real economist, may spill over. We have some potential dangerous spots in the world, including actually the possible conflict between China and Taiwan. And also there are some possible actually red spots on the global map. So that's a real problem, and we cannot really predict what would happen in the near future. In terms of actually the possibilities, because I would like to also say that there are some positive things related actually to the situation right now. And some of them were already mentioned. Actually, there's a possibility, and everybody talks about the green transition. Actually, Professor Michael Spence, who is the Nobel Prize winner, quite recently, in his article published about three days ago, he mentioned that actually the transition to the green economy is the future, not only for Ukraine, but also for Europe and for the rest of the world. But he pointed out at the extreme market volatility which is happening right now, and he pointed out that also, we have actually very high energy prices, which is visible, especially the fossil fuels. Actually, the prices are spiraling, and we don't really know what will mean in the short time. Definitely, in the longer period, the green transition would have a major impact on elimination of those fuels. In terms of actually what this may happen and what would be the future role of China, I think that China is benefiting from this conflict, definitely. I mean, the Russian economy is weakening, and the role of Russia is diminishing right now. We've seen the unification of some actually, forces in Europe. Probably the NATO will be expanding, as we know right now. The Scandinavian countries who were long time kept their neutrality will be joining the NATO. So that's one thing. There's actually also, I think it will strengthen the European Union after all. So those are the positive effects. Now, Chinese are trying right now to insulate themselves from, and they are trying to learn from the crisis. Especially they are looking very carefully at Russia, and they are looking at to what degree the sanctions, international sanctions, are impacting the Russian economy, and they are trying to insulate their financial markets right now. And this will actually be probably a major change in their policy. Another point which probably Krzysztof would support me is that we see a shift, further shift in the Chinese-U.S. relations. Actually, those economies are drifting apart, stronger and stronger, and also the impact on the Chinese actually. Investment trade in some parts of the world is diminishing, even though they managed to invest heavily and make dependence number of African countries. I think that the Western countries have realized also that not only from the point of view of the supply channel safety, but also from the point of view of the security in terms of rare metals and all that. This is the time actually to carefully look at what is happening in the globalization. And the globalization as such will be changing. We know already that there are certain shifts, for instance, in terms of production of microprocessors. For instance, in the United States, at the moment, the biggest factory of microprocessors is being built. It will start to produce within the next 5 to 6 years. But nevertheless, we see already those moves. So basically, I would like to sum up. This is the common sense. The situation is unclear, but definitely the world that we know, and especially the globalization that we've seen, is changing quite rapidly in front of our eyes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacek. When I moderate the discussion, I'm usually, after the presenting of the speech of a panelist, I give the opportunity to each of you to exchange the ideas, to make the comments to each other presentation. So if anybody likes to make a comment to some other presentation or extend in some way your own presentation, so I give 5 minutes to exchange the ideas. Please, if you have any questions, any comments.
So the question is to Dmytro and to Irina and Mariana. I was uplifted, by the way, by your Dmytro, your statistics that 80% of arable land is firmly under the control of Ukraine. In terms of assets, let's talk about productive assets. And if you look at the economy writ large, so that's everything that is productive. What were the areas so far hit the hardest that has caused most damage, either directly or indirectly through the impact on the rest of the economy? You mentioned agriculture that is in reasonable shape, but what about the rest of the economy?
To answer this question, so Dmytro probably meant that 20%, which are now occupied by Russia, also include Crimean Peninsula and the territories occupied before, so in 2014. So altogether, they occupy 20% of the Ukrainian territory. And unfortunately, most of those territories are the home place to most productive capabilities of Ukraine. Most of our plants, industrial facilities are located in Donbas region. That is why that is the problem, because those plants and factories are unable to pay taxes just as like their employees. But on the other hand, some of them are still working. Those that are still under the Ukrainian control, they are working, they are producing what they can. But the problem is transportation, because most of those factories and plants produce raw materials, and we have been exporting them through ports at the Sea of Azov, which is blocked right now, and on the Black Sea, through Mykolaiv which is not occupied, and Odessa, which is also not occupied, thankfully. But it is impossible to do so since there are warships in the Black Sea. So that is a problem. The logistics. It's impossible to transport most of the raw materials from the eastern part, even if they are not under the occupation, to the western borders through railway and automobile transport. That is a problem, the transportation. And as to the other part of Ukraine, so it is mostly about small and medium businesses. So it is light industry, like something that does not contribute that much to the budget. So mostly those companies have a small impact on the income side of the budget. They are able to pay taxes, and they do so. But unfortunately, those state-owned companies and greatest producers of Ukrainian main export goods were located in those occupied areas. One of the ways to compensate for those losses was the requirement of the government from the state-owned companies and also from the NBU to transfer their 2021 revenues profits to the budget ahead of the schedule to fulfill the budget with the money. But, well, actually it's not enough. And of course, some of the companies which managed to relocate to the western borders and have done so are trying to rebuild their chains, but still it requires a lot of time. I would also like to ask Krzysztof about the impact of cancellation of all import duties on the Ukrainian exporting goods. So in the middle of May, the European Union has made a revolutionary decision to cancel all import duties to the Ukrainian goods, especially agricultural ones. So will it have bad impact on the agricultural sector of the producers inside the European Union? Or will they manage somehow to overcome this problem? Because European Union is helping really a lot to the Ukrainian economy, and this one more step can be deteriorating their own position. So won't it happen in the nearest future?
Well, I'm a big believer in competition and in the wonders that it can produce. So if the Europeans face more competition from Ukrainian goods, so much the better. Greater choice, greater competitive pressure. There should be absolutely zero concern about that. We are not talking about the United States or Argentina or some other, Canada or Australia, huge agricultural producers. That's one thing. Secondly, I think in this hour of need, anything that Europe can do to help Ukraine should be appreciated. And politically, that should also go down well. I don't necessarily think that would be subject to the type of political debates that we've seen in Europe around agriculture production. So,
can I also actually make a comment related to the reconstruction of Ukraine? And I think that this is a very serious issue because even though we have still the war raging and we really don't know when it will be over and in what sense. But on the other hand, there's a lot of effort right now. A number of actually countries and international organizations are geared up towards reconstruction of Ukraine. And we are, at the moment we know approximately the estimates of the cost of reconstruction of Ukraine at the present state as it is at about $600 billion. I would like to put it in comparison with the previous actually assistance to Ukraine from the European Union and from the US combined together between 2014 and the February 2022, which was about 20 billion. So we are talking about the possible, about the needs actually being 30 times higher. And we also know that number of organizations, countries are coming up with very substantial humanitarian assistance and other programs that would include a huge influx of funds into Ukraine. So this is a possible chance. Actually, I mean, the chance is that actually the Ukrainian economy can be reconstructed in such a way which will be much more energy efficient If you travel to Kiev, you've probably seen how private citizens are taking the insulation in their hands, and on huge blocks of flats there are patches of individual flats which are insulated against the program, or the whole building should be insulated. So that's one thing. The green transformation, it's another. Departure from the heavy industry towards a smart economy. This is another issue really important. So basically, I believe that actually Ukraine can do a free block towards a new economy, but this would require from donors a very intelligent approach, because I'm involved in a number of initiatives right now towards actually, on one hand, monitoring of the humanitarian assistance, on the other hand, actually rebuilding of Ukrainian economy. And the major issues that are being repeated, perhaps not loudly, but actually still that's one of the major concerns, is the level of corruption, and to what degree we are going to control and monitor corruption, and how we can lower corruption. So that's one thing. Then the capacity of the Ukrainian institutions that have to be improved. Also, actually, there's a need of institutional change in Ukraine. There are a number of changes needed, a number of safeguards that need to be put in place so this flow of funds could be used effectively. Another worry which comes to me is that if we indeed see a huge influx of funds into Ukraine, we should be aware that actually they can potentially destroy the local economy. So actually this reconstruction in Ukraine should be actually led by private sector growth, by privatization of state-owned enterprises. At the same time, it would be necessary really to monitor whether those funds are not destroying the local economy, which they are not targeting at purchasing of goods from the countries around. So basically, this would result in the Ukrainian companies dying out because of this unfair competition. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think that we have 10, 15 minutes, no more. So I think that it's time to questions given by the general audience, and I will omit the point which I have indicated in our communication, the question inspired by the book by Bernard Mandeville, The Fable of Bees and Private Vices and Public Benefits. But we are celebrating the Jan Winiecki, and I think that I can give questions in his name. He was a classical liberal, and now we are observing that during the war, some Ukraine government steps are done to develop the more market-oriented economy, the lowering of the taxes, diminishing the barrier to entry, to open the business, and so on. So I would like to ask to all the participants, all the panelists, the important questions. To what extent in the next decades after the ending of the war, which I think will soon happen, the market economy will be present and the capitalist systems will be developed in Ukraine. And first of all, to what extent there is an opportunity to overcome the problems from the past related to the great corruption and the oligarchy in Ukraine. To what extent these problems will be overcome by the Ukrainian society and Ukrainian government. Can I ask to say a few words? Some of the panelists, I will not indicate anybody, but maybe some of you would like to make a comment.
I can start if I may. Actually, I don't think that Ukrainian leadership currently is market-oriented. If you will have a look on decisions of president office, they are very paternalistic, and I would say they are even to some extent a kind of socialistic. They have this way of thinking. They are talking about increasing role of the state, increasing role of the government, more state interventions, and unfortunately, that's a sad truth. I don't think that Ukrainian leadership, which probably will remain longer than this term of presidency because of high popularity of current President Volodymyr Zelensky, will change in some way. Without some external push, I'm very skeptical about our movement towards market economy.
Thank you, Dima. Anybody else? Comment?
Yes, I'd like to offer a slightly different take, not in contradiction to what Mitra has said, but just on a different track. Physical assets that are destroyed are not that difficult to rebuild. Money is fungible wherever it comes from. You can build the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, bridges and roads and railroads. That can be done. There's engineering expertise. Money is available and you can do it. You can rebuild the housing stock, public and private. Private capital will come in and will start operations under the assumption that there are functional institutions to uphold the rule of law and so on. What is much more difficult to replicate or restore is the human capital and the legacy, or maybe not the legacy, but the what I would call the institutional memory of the best practices of governance. To the extent that they existed, you can possibly recreate them to some extent. But human capital in general will be much more difficult to recreate. One, because of the loss of the most able who have fled, and presumably not all of them will return. But also maybe to some extent to what Dmitry has said, maybe there will be legacy issues that are carried over as simple replication of the past, and that could be also a hindrance in how efficient Ukraine can rebuild.
I'm also more optimistic than Dmytro. Of course, right now the state is taking a very big part in dealing with the economic issues, but that is obvious because the war is ongoing. That is why we have now war-oriented economy instead of market-oriented. But I think that will make a big impulse to forget everything we had before and to start from the scratch. The very first steps were made at the beginning of the war when the government decided to cancel most of the VAT taxes. They eased the conditions for doing business, and I hope they will remain most of those simplifications even for investors after the war is over. And as a result, we will be able to attract people from abroad to come here, to work here, and show a good example to the Ukrainian producers and to Ukrainian economy. I'm really optimistic about that, even if we have seen a huge migration, even of those who are highly professionals in their field I think they will return with new knowledge back to Ukraine and will start building a new powerful economic system in their country, in Ukraine.
As for me, I'm more optimistic too, but I think the situation with transnational organized crime in Ukraine will be huge after the war. And if you know, the corruption is one of the part of these crimes. And but I think that hard times grow up a strong people. And I hope that money, it's not to all people the most important thing. And I hope that these strong people will do what is possible to them to grow up our economy, to fight crimes, to fight corruption, and we have I hope a great future after this stupid war.
And I would like to also mention that actually the hope lies in the Ukrainian attempts actually to join the Europe actually and the European integration. The officially the path towards Ukraine joining the European Union is open, but I do not see the EU agreeing to accept Ukraine until the institutional changes and also are made and the level of corruption is lowered. So this is absolutely necessary. But I mean, still, there's a certain possibility for the greater integration. And it happens, for instance, at the level of infrastructure. I spent some time working for the railways. For instance, for me, the decision of opening up, the normal gauge railways in Ukraine by connecting rail and the rail system between Ukraine and Europe is very important, even though it's a huge infrastructural sort of task to be done. But as I said, I think that Ukraine has no other way but only to follow the path of these institutional changes, of changing the level of corruption. And also, I mean, I fully agree with Krzysztof that the human side of it is extremely important. Thank you.
So thank you. And I think that it's time to the questions given by the general audience. I see that on the chat there is no questions, but maybe who is physically present in Rzeszów would like to ask the question to the participants or make a short comment. I think that it might be done in Polish, and Krzysztof or Jacek will translate it if there is a problem in that. So anybody from the general audience would like to take a part in our discussion?
Hello, Witek. Hello, Dima. Nice to see especially Dima, whom I know for many, many years because we used to cooperate, case Ukraine, case Warsaw. Well, I have a question to Dima. Dima is very pessimistic, and I would like that Dima tells more why he is so pessimistic. I think that the war, the people who live through the war, and especially the people who have to fight with Russians and lead the nations to fight the war, to fight the Russians, the invasion, I think this is a great, very negative, but also it can be seen as a positive experience, and it should influence the behavior of people like our friends, economists from Ukraine explained. So can you dwell a bit on that? And can you say more why you are so negative about the current government? Thank you.
Maybe I'm negative because following decision making and the process of delivering those decisions. There was mentioned that they reduced taxes at the initial stage. Actually, I would say it was a hasty decision, and I would say not very clever one, because currently they are returning those taxes, and it's not the point of the level of taxation. It's a point of administration. It was like a hasty decision, let's cut taxes, let's make life for people easier. While on the first months of the war, people have funds from previous life, people have some savings, reserves. But now situation is aggravated, and they are returning taxes to the previous level. All those tax privileges will be eliminated. It's already a decision which will be delivered to the public or in effect very, very soon this way or not. This is a concern responding to the point that they are a kind of liberal. They are not liberal at all. They are talking a lot of about need of more role of the government, stronger role of authorities in decision making, etc., etc. Why I'm pessimistic on our like prospects? It's my main point that this war will be protracted, and we have no idea how it will end. And we see on our personal level, and we also have some results of surveys. Unfortunately, I cannot tell the numbers, but surveys tell that many Ukrainians will not return too many Ukrainians will not return to the country if the conflict will be in a kind of frozen stage. If Russia is not totally defeated, many people will have concern on their security. A lot of talks about security of children, because if you are of military age and very high patriotic, very strong patriotic sentiments, so people are ready to fight till the end. But what about children? And if you are thinking about children, probably you will not, you will consider seriously their future in more safe places. And that's already, it's not only my decision, as I mentioned, it's our talks with many friends on our personal level. Surveys depict this kind of sentiments are strong. And the authorities, they do not have respond to this situation. We are discussing, as I mentioned, we are discussing Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan means that the enemy was totally defeated, and it's just a framework, a decision how to rebuild in an efficient way. But what to do if the conflict is not finished? How to live? And we started talking that it's a kind of Wild West, or in Ukraine we have Dikke Pole. It's a territory which under permanent threat of new aggression, and you can keep people there only if they have enough of economic freedoms. And discussion in different working groups with those people from the authorities which are responsible for economic policies show that are totally reject this idea of more economic freedoms. They simply do not accept. They want more taxes to be collected, and they want their state to become a kind of benevolent planner to give those funds to the direction they decide are good and should be developed. And they don't totally reject the possibility that people will not want to return. This kind of logic of a state official, that you will have no choice. You will return anyway here, and I will decide what you will do. But the situation has changed. People are revising their plans for future. They are seriously revising, and Ukrainian authorities, they are far from understanding this tendency. That's why I'm maybe not that much optimistic.
Thank you, Dima, and thank you, Eva. Anybody would like to continue and to ask the questions and make a comment? We have still, let's say, 4 minutes or so.
I have small comments and one question. I think that nobody tell us that it will be easy. But I think that Ukrainians united like never. and the world are united like never. And we have a chance to grow up for the shortly period, I think. But we should work hard. And my question is to the panelists: how do you think? Is it good time to Ukraine to become a part of Europe Union? I know that we have corruption, a lot of problems, economics and others, but I think that Ukraine now have good represent our force, our possibilities, and as for me, we need it now as never. Thank you.
Well, I could make a comment from the perspective of the former international institution bureaucrat. I don't think that there is a real possibility that Ukraine can join the European Union in the very near future. And I've spelled out all those conditions necessary. But on the other hand, there's this preparatory moment. Actually, we may have transition period when this opportunity and possibility of joining the European Union is open. And I still believe that this would be possibly one of the major kind of like a stimulus to push towards the institutional changes in Ukraine, political changes, you name it. This is the only chance, and if the Ukraine doesn't take this chance, then I don't think that there's a real perspective of joining the European Union. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think Ukraine has a good moment to accede to the European Union. I'm not sure that this is possible under the current institutional framework. So the EU would have to create kind of a backdoor access, or as Jacek has said, change the criteria of a middle access with an accelerated accession later on. And this would also send a political signal to the rest of Europe that if Europe wants to be at peace, it has to be united. And it also sends a powerful signal to Russia that it would face a determined society writ large across the entire continent. I don't know.
I am proud that I have no one friend that I know. They don't have our army right now. And I think that we really united like never. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody from general audience would like to ask questions? I look on the clock. Hopefully the organizers will forbid me that I overcome some constraints.
Yeah, there's a question.
Nobody
Right. So, Dr. Maciej Żegowski from the Chair of Entrepreneurship, and I have a question maybe from the perspective of classical liberals. I didn't have chance to meet Professor Winiecki, unfortunately, but this perspective seems to me very important. And the question is, how can we bring together this classical liberal perspective and Marshall Plan, which is the new Marshall Plan from Ukraine, which is not, I think, anything related that much to this classical liberal thought. Thank you.
I think without getting too ideological, I would say free markets reign where they can allocate the capital most efficiently to the best uses to produce the best outcomes. There are market failures, and there are special cases where public intervention is needed and justified, even under classical precepts. And I think war is one of those. And Marshall Plan happened right after the war, so it addressed an acute need to reshuffle international capital in favor of those who didn't have it. So it was basically a reallocation of global capital where it was ample to the areas where it was scarce, and public funds would not have flowed as freely. In fact, the public funds were a catalyst for private funds to come in on the assurance that there would be an institutional oversight of the rule of law and some of the other institutional fabric. So without going into the details of how the Marshall Plan could be replicated for Ukraine, I think public intervention through international bodies, however defined, existing like IMF or ad hoc, like Marshall Plan was, would be fully justified. And I don't think Professor Winiecki would have anything against it unless he had anything against the Marshall Plan in the 1940s.
And on the top of that, I already mentioned, I don't believe that the Marshall Plan could be replicated as it was delivered during the times when it was delivered. And I think that the international community has learned a lot of lessons since then, and how such an assistance can actually destroy or disrupt the economy. So I would like to actually once again emphasize the restructuring of Ukraine has to actually happen through stimulation of private sector growth. And it is absolutely necessary to actually embark on a serious privatization. And we can look at Poland, actually, when some, for instance, like privatization of state-owned enterprises has resulted in some serious problems that we are experiencing right now. And I think that Ukraine should actually learn from those mistakes that we've made in Poland. Thank you.
So, thank you. I think that we ought to go to the end of the session because we overcome the time given us by the organizers. But if anybody would like to give a short question, very important one, it's the last time to do it. If not, I would like to thank you all the panelists for the very interesting speech, very interesting discussion. And I would like to thank all those who were present and give the questions. I agree that there may be some problems with accessing of Ukraine to the European Union, but I think that this time is a great opportunity for the Ukrainians to be much closer in terms of a mentality with the Western societies, and to be this experience of emigration and seeing what is how the West is organized and how it's the people in the West are thinking, may give the results in the next generation, like it was in the case of Poland when in the 70s of the 20th century, a great number of people went to the West and were seeing that it's possible to live in different way. So I think that the same may be in the case of the Ukraine as today's. And of course, it's not possible to see it in the next few years, but in the next generation, the positive results of that will be seen. So thank you. I will end the session by using my Liberty Bell. And, I wish all participants fruitful discussion in the next sessions of the conference. Thank you, and see you on the screen, like online. So thank you once more.